It was the sort of tale folks claimed could not be true. Impossible, they murmured, for a person like Marcus De Angelo does not go missing. Not a fellow like him, 6'3", 215 pounds of hard muscle and swagger, the sort of person who commanded room space before he opened his mouth. And yet, in the early morning of March 17, 1990, Marcus disappeared from Birmingham, Alabama, as though the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. But how does a man like him just disappear? The night started like any other party after a big win. The Delta Kappa fraternity house on the university's border, white paint flaking off, porch creaking under the weight of too many parties and years of aging. Marcus pulled up around 9 that night, still clad in his red varsity jacket, with the school's emblem sewn over his heart. His friends recalled seeing him laughing, his arms slung around his best friend Tony Rizzo, the team's linebacker with a smile as broad as the field. Inside, the air reeked of sweat, cheap perfume, and the driving beat of some forgettable pop tune. It was boisterous, packed, mundane, and then Marcus departed. That was the first odd thing. He wasn't much of a drinker. He had too much at stake in his future. A scholarship, scouts to watch him, a straightforward route to the pros. At 11:30, a group of people witnessed him walking towards the parking lot, hands shoved deep into pockets, head lowered. One student, Jennifer Callahan, reported waving at him from the porch, but failing to receive a wave back. She thought maybe he hadn't seen her, or maybe he just didn't want to. The following morning, his vehicle was discovered 3 miles from campus along Shades Creek Park. It was a dark blue 1986 Chevrolet Cavalier, which was parked at an odd angle. The driver's door was open, the keys remaining in the ignition, turned halfway as though the engine was shut down abruptly. The headlights had lowered the battery overnight. As the park ranger walked up, he picked up a whiff of a metallic scent inside the vehicle, iron-like. Detective showed up in an hour. Harold Pritchard, an old, seasoned detective who'd have more bleak conclusions than he had fingers on one hand, popped open the trunk and stood still. There was blood. Not very much, but sufficient to inform him that something awful had occurred. Sufficient to indicate that Marcus hadn't just done a runner. The blood was sticky, dark around the edges where it began to dry, but no fingerprints except for Marcus's, no gun and no fight. And there was no corpse. By lunchtime, the scene was cordoned off by yellow police tape that whipped back and forth in the March chill. That night, the news was on every local station. Birmingham was a small town at the time, the type where everyone knew somebody who knew somebody else. Marcus's mother, Diane D'Angelo, was on TV, her voice trembling as she begged for clues. She was flanked by Marcus's younger sister, just 16, holding a stuffed bear to her chest and mumbling not a word. Diane implored help, sobbing and whispering that Marcus was her son, her boy, and no one emerged. In 2 days, the university had mounted a grand search. Scores came, students, teachers, store owners, even competing athletes. They funneled through Shades Creek Park in long groups, flashlights piercing the dark morning. The earth was mushy and lumpy, littered with wet leaves that smelled musty with each step. The volunteers shouted out Marcus's name until they could no longer speak. They discovered broken bottles, beer cans, a rusty bike frame, but no sign of Marcus. Nothing whatsoever. The city was altered afterward. The news reported his disappearance every night. Channel 6 broadcasted interviews with teammates, all of whom were at a loss for words. Tony Rizzo interviewed with red-rimmed eyes, telling that Marcus had everything in front of him, that he was going pro. The camera recorded the quiver in his hands and the tension in his voice. Viewers throughout the city were burdened by it. Posters covered everything, on phone poles, in shop windows, under windshield wipers. Marcus's senior portrait revealed a smiling young man with reserved confidence. Underneath it, thick letters proclaimed, "Missing, Marcus De Angelo. Last seen March 17, 1990. Called Birmingham PD." Those posters became part of the city itself, reminding people that something was fundamentally, irreversibly wrong. Detective Pritchard slept little. His desk was stacked with files, maps, and photos of the car. He interviewed them all again. Everyone's stories checked out, except for most things fit. Marcus had appeared okay, perhaps a bit quieter, but okay. He departed early without much comment, but the detective picked up on tiny discrepancies. One of them reported seeing Marcus talking to someone in the parking lot, couldn't identify who he was. Another said Marcus received a call that evening, went out to answer it, and came back preoccupied. Under pressure for specifics, memories went hazy. Individuals second-guessed. Perhaps it wasn't Marcus. Perhaps it was someone else. The trunk blood was tested and read as O-positive, Marcus's blood type. The quantity indicated a severe wound, but not necessarily fatal. There were no prints from an unknown person, no hair samples, no DNA from another source. In 1990, DNA analysis was new, untested, and beyond most local budgets. That was it for the trail. But even after all these years, one question still haunts. What actually did happen to Marcus De Angelo that evening? Because individuals do not just disappear without leaving anything behind. And in Birmingham, somewhere, somebody still does know what happened to him. Along with 1990 came the lack of equipment which one day would crack seemingly unsolvable cases. DNA analysis was not yet reliable enough. Forensic databases were rudimentary, and what detectives primarily worked with were intuitions rather than machines. For Marcus De Angelo's relatives, this translated to one thing: waiting. And waiting was torture in itself.
Diane De Angelo no longer slept.
She spent her nights in Marcus's bedroom amidst his trophies, picture frames, and the lingering fragrance of his cologne still on the walls. She waited for the phone to ring, for the door to knock, for something that would shatter the silence. Her husband Vincent, a factory hand with calloused hands and a gravelly voice, paced the house in agitated figures until the floorboards creaked beneath his feet.
He longed to do something, anything, but there was nothing to do.
The neighborhood mobilized to help. Candlelight vigils occupied the courtyard beside the university chapel. Hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder in the chilly evening air, singing hymns and offering whispered prayers. Small flames danced and flared in the gusts as if even the candles were fighting to survive. A local minister spoke of hope and faith, but to many the words rang hollow.
Faith couldn't replace Marcus's void, and hope couldn't bring him home.
As March spilled into April and April into May, the search parties dwindled. News crews packed up and went to cover other stories. The posters were bleached away by the sun. Life, as it inevitably does, started to move along, but for those who cared about Marcus De Angelo, time froze on March 17, 1990. It never would begin again. The search branched out into a dozen different directions. Each new lead promised so much at first, before it collapsed into nothing when examined closely. Detective Harold Pritchard was like he was trying to contain water in his hands. No matter how hard he clenched, it just seeped through his fingers. Each clue became rumor. Each rumor became nothing. And then at last something. Or at least something that appeared to be something. 3 days later, a gas station clerk named Earl Hutchins came into the Birmingham Police Department. He operated the night shift at a Texaco located about 2 miles from Shades Creek Park, and this night he couldn't keep still, his nerves obviously on edge. He informed Pritchard that about midnight on March 17th, a blue car had stopped at the station, possibly a Chevy, possibly another make. The driver just sat there with the engine idling but never exited. Earl could not tell the man's face as the overhead lights had been out for weeks, but he recalled that the driver seemed nervous, near panicked. The car drove off after a couple of minutes and moved in the direction of the park. When Pritchard asked him if it might have been Marcus's car, Earl hesitated. He didn't know. Blue cars all blurred together in the dark. But then he mentioned something else. He saw movement in the passenger seat. A shadow, a form, perhaps another human being. Or perhaps it was the way the light reflected off the windshield. He couldn't say for sure. The tale was interesting but light. When the detectives reviewed the Texaco security tapes, they discovered the camera was broken for over a month. All they had to go on was Earl's testimony, and his memory was full of maybes, but it provided one valuable lead. Marcus may not have been alone that evening. A week later, another tip came in from a woman named Patricia Owens, a local high school teacher who jogged the trails around Shades Creek every morning. She told police that on the morning of March 18th, just after dawn, she'd heard something strange, a cry or maybe a shout, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the woods. It was distant, faint, and vanished almost before she saw it. She thought that it might have been children playing, possibly an animal, and continued running. Pritchard walked her back to the trail where they retraced her route. She indicated a heavy thicket 1/4 of a mile from where Marcus's car was discovered. Search parties had already covered that ground twice, but they searched it again, more slowly this time, eyeing every inch. They didn't discover Marcus. But they did discover something, a piece of torn cloth, snagged on a branch. It was dark blue, maybe from a jacket. Forensic analysis later revealed it was a standard cotton-polyester mix, the type used in hundreds of companies. It might have been Marcus's. It might have been anyone's. Next was a tip that stunned the team the most. One evening, outside the university library, a student by the name of Kevin Marsh came up to Pritchard. Kevin was reserved, quiet, one of those players who got little playing time but never missed practice. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, his eyes fluttering back and forth nervously as he talked. He told Pritchard that he had witnessed Marcus fighting with someone outside the Delta Kappa house the night of the party. Arguing, not just talking. Voices bellowed, shoulders stiff, rage thick between them. Kevin couldn't determine who the other guy was. It had been too dark. But he believed it to be another player, someone tall, someone Marcus knew. When Pritchard asked him why Kevin hadn't said anything about this earlier, the boy shrugged. Guys fought all the time, he explained. It hadn't seemed like a big deal, but now that Marcus was missing, it didn't feel like nothing any longer. It felt like everything. Detective Pritchard took Kevin into a room for questioning and quizzed him for hours. Who was the other guy? Kevin had no idea. What were they fighting about? He couldn't make out. How long did it go on? A few minutes, possibly less. By the time they were done, even Pritchard wasn't certain whether Kevin had actually witnessed something, or if the pressure of the investigation had caused him to make up details. All the teammates were re-questioned. Alibis were verified and re-verified. Tony Rizzo, Marcus's closest friend, cried during his second interrogation. He vowed he knew nothing. He insisted Marcus was like a brother, that he could never do anything to harm him. Pritchard believed him, but belief is not proof. The inconsistencies mounted. There were witnesses who said Marcus departed the party alone, others who vowed he had a companion with him. Some described him as being in good spirits. Others described him as troubled, remote, as if there was something pressing him. In the midst of that jumble of contradictory accounts, the truth lay hidden, and Pritchard couldn't dig deep enough to uncover it. By late April, desperation had arrived. The department was thinning out, the community was frantic, and the mayor's office demanded answers. Pritchard's captain, Lou Brennan, was under a crushing load of pressure, from city officials, from the university, from frightened parents who now saw their own kids staring back at Marcus and the missing posters plastered around town. They needed a suspect, and they needed him now. The first name that came up was almost too good to be true. Derek Calhoun, the Auburn University linebacker, Birmingham's arch-rival. Derek and Marcus had a prolonged, bitter feud. Their battles on the field were the stuff of legend, explosive, intense, and personal. In their final game in November 1989, Derek had laid a vicious late hit that put Marcus on the sidelines for a week. The two confronted each other afterward, and some said threats were exchanged. Although no one ever quite recalled what was said, everyone recalled the expression in their eyes. At that time that Marcus went missing, a call came to the Birmingham Police Department. The tip alleged that Derek Calhoun, the Auburn linebacker, who had been Marcus's on-field nemesis, had been spotted in Birmingham on the evening of March 17th. If so, it could destroy his alibi. Detective Pritchard acted quickly. Derek was 21, built like a truck, with a square jaw and a face that looked permanently angry. He sat across from Pritchard in the interrogation room, arms crossed, radiating defiance. When asked where he'd been that night, Derek said he was in Auburn, more than an hour away at his girlfriend's apartment. He had witnesses. Pritchard checked. The girlfriend confirmed it. So did her roommate. Even a neighbor testified they'd heard the two fighting behind the walls at 11 o'clock. The alibi was foolproof. Derek left the station a free man, and Pritchard was still where he began. No suspect, no leads, no solutions. The next theory was jealousy. Marcus had been dating a girl named Melissa Trent, a junior education major with a long blonde ponytail and smile so bright he could illuminate a room. Their romance was recent, only 2 months young, but already someone was angry about it. Melissa's ex-boyfriend, Craig Donovan, hadn't been pleased about the split. Craig was a business student who was hot-tempered and liked to get into a fight or two at a bar. He'd even once confronted Marcus outside a campus cafeteria, pushing him and yelling that he better leave Melissa alone. Marcus had left in silence, but Craig had continued to yell, flush-faced and trembling. Pritchard pulled on Craig's record, 2 arrests for disorderly conduct and 1 for assault, charges which were later dropped. Craig was the type of profile that caught investigators' attention: violent, controlling, unstable. On April 22nd, detectives visited Craig's apartment. They discovered him unconscious, drunk on the couch with empty bottles and the smell of old beer all around him. His roommate informed them Craig had been drinking night and day for days since the night Marcus disappeared. He'd gone to a bar, the Rusty Nail, that evening, and remained there from 9 p.m. until closing time at 2. The bartender remembered him. So did a few regulars. He'd been boisterous, careless, hardly on his feet. There was no way he could have even driven somewhere, let alone planned and carried out a crime. Another lead fell apart, and Pritchard was left facing yet another blank board. By the summer of 1992, the Marcus De Angelo case had become what every detective fears: a file too cold to handle and too sad to forget. The evidence conflicted at each turn. Witnesses contradicted one another, timelines unraveled, and the truth, whatever it was, continued to recede further. Pritchard struggled to keep the case alive, resisting when his captain, Lou Brennan, recommended shifting manpower to fresher investigations. But it couldn't be denied. They had pursued every tip, interviewed every witness, and had nothing. No body, no weapon, no suspect who could withstand intense examination. The case was never closed. Departments do not use that term. It was archived, boxed and tagged, shelved in the precinct basement where the air reeked of mildew and broken promises. Pritchard made it personal. He had cracked hundreds of cases over the years and learned to live with the handful he couldn't. But Marcus was special. Perhaps it was his age with the bright future that everyone thought he was destined for. Perhaps it was Diane D'Angelo's voice over the phone, shaking every time she phoned to ask him for news. Whatever it was, Pritchard felt the burden of failure as a weight in his chest. He retired in 1995, 3 years after the case froze up. On his final day, he went down to that dark storage room and saw the box marked De Angelo, Marcus, case 90 to 4371. He didn't touch it. He couldn't. For the D'Angelo family, there wasn't any such thing as moving on. Diane quit her job at the law firm. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't pretend the world still made sense. She spent her days in Marcus's room, kept just as he had left it. His varsity jacket was on the back of the door. His cleats rested in the corner, still coated with red clay from the practice field. The trophies stood on the shelves, their golden figures captured in moments of victory. She dusted them every week, taking great care as though cleaning them might keep Marcus alive. Her husband, Vincent, did his best to keep the family intact, but mourning isolates more than it binds. He kept himself busy at work, working double shifts at the factory until his body protested. He returned home late, spent with the smell of machine grease and sweat on him, too exhausted to talk. He and Diane exchanged few words anymore. What was there to say? Their son had died, and nothing they could say would alter that. Marcus's younger sister, Angela, pulled back into silence. She'd been 16 when he vanished, full of dreams and aspirations for the future. She dreamed of being a veterinarian once. Once Marcus was gone, that disappeared too. She flunked out of college after 1 semester, moved to Atlanta, and cut off nearly everyone from her past. Birmingham had become intolerable, a city of ghosts and memories she couldn't bear. The university retired Marcus's number 23 jersey at halftime of the 1993 homecoming game. Diane and Vincent sat on the front row as the athletic director addressed legacy and memory. The stadium erupted into applause as the crowd came to its feet. Diane quietly wept into her hands. Vincent sat there, stone-faced, jaw clenched, eyes unshed. They dedicated a plaque in the locker room with Marcus's name on it. For several years he was queried about by players. Coaches reminisced. But other seasons arrived, new heroes were born, and remembrance dissipated. Life went on, uncaring as ever. Each year on the 17th of March, Diane visited Shades Creek Park. She stood beside where Marcus's car had been discovered. A small group of people were around her who still recalled. Candles danced in the crisp air as prayers were murmured. Diane always spoke, her voice shaking but resolute, calling out for anyone who might know something to step forward. Every year the number of people was fewer. 10 dwindled to 5, 5 to 3. At the end of the decade, it was only Diane, standing by herself in the darkness, calling out her son's name into the wind. Marcus De Angelo's tale became legend, the sort of horror story one heard in hushed tones when discussing Birmingham's darker side. "Remember that footballer who disappeared in the 90s?" they'd whisper. "Never located. Never discovered what became of him." The facts blurred with the years, distorted by rumor and imagination. Others said Marcus had gotten involved with drugs, although there was never any evidence. Others said he'd fled to hide from some secret shame. But those who actually knew him dismissed such rumors. Marcus wasn't fleeing anything. He was fleeing to everything. And yet even all these years later, there's a question that refuses to rest. What actually happened to Marcus De Angelo on that date, March 17, 1990? The answer, if there ever was one, was deep in the silence somewhere. The Marcus De Angelo case could have remained there forever, were it not for a bureaucratic reorganization deep within the Birmingham Police Department in late 2023. That winter, the cold case unit, overly forgotten and woefully understaffed, gained a modest but significant increase in funding and 2 new detectives. Among them was Rachel Kovach, 34 years old, quick-witted and persistent, with green eyes that missed nothing. Rachel had grown up in Birmingham. She was just a kid when Marcus went missing, but she recalled the flyers pinned to telephone poles, the candlelight vigils, the quiet unease that clung to the city for months afterward. When she had moved to the cold case unit, Marcus's file was among the first she removed from the shelves. She spent 3 days in isolation in the archives, with boxes of crumbling paper and yellowing photographs around her, reading each report, each interview, each shred of evidence ever obtained. The case was a labyrinth, 30 years of dead ends and lost chances, but Rachel had a talent for recognizing patterns where other people recognized only confusion. It didn't take long for something to stand out to her. In the initial report, she picked up on a tidbit that Pritchard had long ago highlighted in red but never pursued. The blood discovered in the trunk of Marcus's vehicle had only been tested for blood type, not DNA. In 1990, DNA testing was expensive, time-consuming, and only used in high-profile killings. But here in 2023, forensic science had advanced light years. Rachel promptly requested that the original samples, 6 carefully sealed, stored for more than 3 decades, be shipped to the Alabama State Forensic Lab for contemporary analysis. The process took months. There were budget approvals, chain of custody checks, and lab backlogs to contend with. But at last, in March of 2024, nearly 34 years to the month Marcus had disappeared, the test results were in. The blood was indeed Marcus's, as predicted, but buried deep within the report was something that made Rachel's heart beat faster: trace levels of foreign DNA, skin cells. Too degraded and too small for 1990 technology to see, but now, thanks to new sequencing, easily identifiable. The foreign DNA didn't turn up anyone in the national database. Whoever it was, he'd never been arrested, never fingerprinted, never been entered into the system. But for the first time in decades, there was a new thread to tug on, a bona fide lead. Rachel began hunting down retired witnesses, individuals who were present at the party when Marcus went missing. They were mostly in their 50s now, spread out around the country, and their recollections were dim and inaccurate after 3 decades. But through the pieces, a name kept popping up and recurring consistently: Brian Hastings. In the initial investigation, Brian had barely been noted. His name had been mentioned only 3 times in the file. He'd been a backup quarterback at the party who never saw any field time. In his statement, he said he'd seen Marcus around 11:30 p.m. leave but hadn't spoken to him. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing worth pursuing. Pritchard had no cause to follow up. But Rachel had learned during her years as a detective, harm often is disguised by unremarkable faces. She retrieved Brian's old student file and began to dig. In 1990, he was 20 years old, studying business administration. Half a year after Marcus went missing, he quit, giving the reason as personal reasons. He then drifted from state to state, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, taking menial jobs and left few paper trails. Then in 2001, he formally changed his name from Brian Hastings to Brian Cole, explaining that he wanted a new beginning. That in itself was a red flag. Individuals change their names for a multitude of reasons, but usually it's with something to rest that they can no longer confront. Rachel tracked him to Asheville, North Carolina, where he'd lived in obscurity for more than a decade. He was a maintenance supervisor for a middle-sized hotel. Neighbors called him courteous but aloof, the type of guy who minding his own business. No spouse, no children, no priors. On paper, he was forgettable. But Rachel's gut was screaming otherwise. She worked with the Asheville Police Department and set up a covert DNA sample collection. An officer tailed Brian to a local diner, waited until he was finished with his coffee, and then collected the thrown-away cup. The sample was sealed, documented, and sent to the Alabama State Forensic Lab. The waiting was harsh. Rachel hardly slept rereading the veteran case files late at night. On one evening, she came across an old photograph from the 1990 team roster, Marcus in the center, smiling broadly, the light glinting in his eyes. Half turned away in the back row was Brian. His face was impassive, remote. They were just inches from each other, two men trapped in the same photo but living different lives. The call arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Rachel was sitting at her desk when the voice of the forensic analyst came through the phone, steady but resolute. The DNA matched. The trace material from the trunk of Marcus belonged to Brian Hastings, now Brian Cole. The margin of error was less than 1 in several billion. A chill wave of adrenaline swept through Rachel. She called the district attorney's office at once and started writing an arrest warrant. But she understood that DNA wasn't sufficient. She required motive, background, a tale the jury would be able to accept. So she returned to the university records, digging through ancient student files and campus documents. That's where she discovered it. A February 1990 harassment complaint filed by Marcus just a few weeks before he disappeared. The complainant said Brian was stalking him, visiting him uninvited, making him feel uneasy. The university had dropped it after one mediation session, and the two men had agreed to stay out of each other's way. Nothing had come of it. But Rachel saw the pattern right away.
Obsession doesn't disappear, it becomes gangrene.
She found Tony Rizzo, Marcus's closest friend and old teammate, now 54 and a high school football coach, in Mobile. Tony had recalled that grievance. Marcus had said that Brian had given him suspicious vibes, that he'd been caught staring too long in the locker room, appearing places where he didn't belong. Tony had dismissed it at the time, told Marcus he was being paranoid. And now, all these years on, he wasn't laughing. Decades later, Tony Rizzo's hand shook as he talked to Detective Kovach on the phone. He hadn't thought of Brian Hastings 30 years, barely remembered the name, but now, with the memories flooding back in, so did the guilt. He had dismissed Marcus's fears all those years before, pushed away the discomfort that had been staring in the face. Now he could barely catch his breath under the burden of what he had not seen. Detective Rachel Kovach constructed her case piece by piece, painstakingly and methodically. Each lead, each morsel of memory counted. She located a former classmate of Brian's, now a Florida real estate agent, who recalled something peculiar. Brian had spoken of Marcus incessantly then. Not as a friend, not even as a rival, but with an unnatural intensity. He had everything, Brian would say. Talent, popularity, a future. The classmate recalled how his voice always carried an undercurrent of resentment, how he spoke like a man outside a window, observing another person living the life he thought was his. At dawn on May 3rd, 2024, Rachel and a group of U.S. Marshals came to Brian Cole's tiny apartment in Asheville, North Carolina. The air was chilly and wet, the morning sky still gray with mist. When Brian opened the door, he bore little resemblance to that boy from those photos. His hair had thinned to silver gray, and deep lines etched his face. He had on a T-shirt and sweatpants, blinking sleepily until recognition flashed in his eyes. Rachel read him the warrant in a quiet, steady voice. When the handcuffs snapped closed on his wrists, she looked at his face for a flash of remorse, a glimmer of guilt, something. But there was nothing.
No sock, no protest.
Only a blank, empty expression. It was as though he had expected this moment and had waited patiently for it all these years.
Within hours, the news was everywhere.
Local television stations interrupted prime-time programming with flashing headlines. Arrest made in 1990 Marcus De Angelo cold case. Newsreaders addressed viewers in quivering tones, half incredulous, half jubilant. Brian Cole, a man who had once been known as Brian Hastings, had been arrested in North Carolina and would be extradited to Alabama to answer a charge of murder.
The city exploded.
Those who'd grown up as kids in 1990 suddenly recalled the fear that had shadowed Birmingham at that time, the vigils, the posters, the whispered prayers. Social media was flooded with images, memories, and incredulity. Old classmates and sports teammates posted messages of tribute for Marcus. Tony Rizzo uploaded an old picture of the two of them on the football ground, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling as if the world belonged to them. His caption, justice. Finally. But the shock ran both ways. Those who had known Brian Hastings, the shy, friendly classmate, the fellow who kept to himself, were shocked. They rushed to put together the person they knew with the accused murderer. Old classmates characterized him as awkward, perhaps lonely but never menacing. He was the type of fellow who'd borrow you a pencil, said Sandra Perkins, a woman who'd sat beside him in econ class. She was interviewed on Channel 6, hands clasped tightly together in her lap, eyes wide and tearful. He never yelled, never created problems. But perhaps that was the problem, she said quietly. Perhaps he was just that good at being invisible that no one ever noticed what was going on underneath. By the time the trial started in January 2025, almost 35 years after Marcus De Angelo disappeared, the Jefferson County Courthouse was full. The gallery was packed daily with reporters, crime buffs, and Birmingham residents who had lived through the case and just needed to see it resolved. Diane De Angelo occupied the front row. She was 73 and frail, her white hair drawn tightly back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Vincent, Marcus's father, had died in 2019, his heart failing him before he could witness justice. Next to Diane sat Angela, Marcus's sister, her face serene and impassive. She'd guarded herself against hope for so long, and she wasn't prepared to let it back in yet. Across the defense table sat Brian Cole, formerly Brian Hastings, lean and gaunt in a too-large suit. His attorney, a beleaguered public defender named Gerald Moss, had no chance. The DNA was overwhelming, but Moss did what he could. He tried to claim contamination, mistake of procedure, the chance that Brian's DNA had been present in the car for some innocent purpose. The prosecution, presented by Assistant District Attorney Karen Whitfield, unraveled each accusation with precision. She led the jury through each shred of evidence. The harassment complaint, the stalking, the timeline had put Brian in proximity to Shades Creek that evening. Her tone was steady and piercing as she outlined a man possessed by jealousy, observing another's success until jealousy morphed into something sinister.
And then in week 3, the case turned in a way nobody could have predicted.
There was a man named Mitchell Brenner who testified, Brian's 1990 roommate. He was interviewed years ago during the initial investigation and said he had no idea. But now, 34 years later, he spun a different yarn. Mitchell testified that on March 17, 1990, Brian returned home at about 2 o'clock in the morning. He was shaking, covered in sweat, white as a ghost. Mitchell was half asleep on the couch, watching the late-night shows when Brian staggered through the door. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't even grasp his keys. When Mitchell questioned him about what had gone wrong, Brian grunted that he'd had an accident, that something awful had occurred.
And then he clammed up, not saying anything else.
Mitchell, drowsy and disoriented, slept again. When he awoke the following morning, Brian had left. He came back that night, serene, subdued, as if nothing at all had occurred. Mitchell acknowledged that he hadn't considered linking it to Marcus's vanishing, or perhaps he simply wasn't willing. Perhaps he'd known in some subconscious corner of his mind and had refused to look. In cross-examination, Whitfield's tone cut. "Did you assist him in washing the automobile?" Mitchell paused, his red and sweaty face. "No," he said, "not quite." But a couple of days later he caught Brian cleaning the trunk of his Cavalier in their apartment car park, bleach, wire brush scrubbing like a fiend. When Mitchell inquired what he was up to, Brian growled at him to mind his own. So he did. He always did. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sound of reporters typing furiously. Judge Carolyn Espinosa slammed her gavel, calling for order, but the damage was already done. Mitchell Brenner had watched evidence being destroyed. He'd stayed silent for 3 decades while a family lived in torment. Whitfield wasted no time announcing that the state would pursue charges against him for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact.
But he wasn't the only one.
And as the trial went on, more names started to emerge. Individuals who'd witnessed something, heard something, but had kept it buried for decades in quiet. The truth finally was slowly starting to break through the surface. And the truth continued to come undone, unraveled thread by agonizing thread, as more people emerged to confess what they'd witnessed, what they'd suspected, and what they'd deliberately looked away from. A current colleague, Jason Ridley, testified that he had seen Brian following Marcus around campus in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. He recalled thinking it was odd, spooky even, but he'd reminded himself that wasn't his concern. "I didn't want to get involved," he said softly from the witness stand. The words hung in the air like a confession. Then there was the bartender. She had been a bartender at a dive bar that went by the name of the Rusty Nail, an establishment long since closed and forgotten, now residing in Florida herself during her retirement days. She remembered how Brian had sat by himself at the counter on the 17th of March, drinking beer after beer and grumbling to himself. He kept saying stuff like, "Some people don't deserve what they have," she said.
At the time, she thought he was just another bitter young man venting his frustrations.
She never imagined it was the last day Marcus De Angelo would ever be seen alive. But the most chilling testimony came from a woman named Lisa Houghton. She dated Brian briefly during the fall of 1989, long enough to glimpse the darkness underneath. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her eyes glassy with tears. She said in court that Brian spoke of Marcus all the time, with a peculiar combination of awe and bitterness. One evening, after too much beer, he had turned to her and said he didn't know what it would be like to rip everything away from someone like Marcus, to see him fall, to watch him lose everything. Lisa then broke up with him shortly thereafter, intimidated by his passion. She never reported what he had said. "I was 20, she breathed, her voice cracking. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." The prosecution contended that Brian hadn't operated in a vacuum. He'd been among people who had noticed the signs, heard the remarks, looked the other way. They were gone now, transferred, deceased, out of reach, but others remained alive, still here, and still accountable for their inaction. Behind her in the front row, Diane De Angelo did not move, her expression a mask of calm drawn taut over years of anger. At recess, a journalist approached her and asked if she had any comment on those who had remained silent all these years. Diane hesitated, not at all. She gazed directly into the camera and spoke, her voice firm as rock. "They took 34 years from me. They let my son's killer live his life while I spent every day wondering if Marcus was still out there. Scared, alone, waiting for someone to find him." Her eyes burned as she added, "I hope they never sleep peacefully again. Not one night." The verdict was delivered on a gray February morning, the type where the sky is heavy with rain, threatening to pour but not quite. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, none of them would look at Brian Cole. That was how Diane knew. She'd seen enough trials, enough documentaries to recognize the knowing silence that precedes a reckoning. When the foreman rose and read the verdict, guilty, murder in the first-degree dot, the words hung in the air, reverberating. For an instant, the room was absolutely quiet. Then a gasp from the gallery, and then the dam was broken. Tears, whispered prayers, whispered hugs. Diane didn't budge. She sat rigid, her fingers clenching the armrest of her chair, fixed in front of her on the back of Brian's head. He didn't turn around. He didn't wince. He sat still, as if the verdict had been for some other person altogether. 2 weeks afterward was the sentencing. Judge Carolyn Espinosa, with her reputation for restraint and justice, stared at Brian Cole with an expression very close to disgust. In her 26 years on the bench, she testified, she witnessed every type of criminal, individuals motivated by desperation, drug addiction, or fear. But Brian was different. "You were motivated," she said to him, "by envy and anger. You destroyed a young man with his entire life in front of him, someone who had done nothing to you but be alive, and you killed him because you couldn't bear to see someone else succeed where you had failed.
Then she handed down the verdict, life in prison without parole.
As deputies took him away in handcuffs, Brian just once looked toward the De Angelo family. For an instant his gaze locked with Diane's. What she saw left her cold. There was no remorse, no protest, no emotion of any kind. Just nothingness. An empty shell where a human should have stood. Outside the courthouse doors, February's biting cold wind howled down the steps as Diane stood there to face the media. Angela stood by her side, saying nothing, her hand on her mother's arm. Diane expressed her gratitude to Detective Kovac, to the prosecutors, and to each person who had refused to let Marcus's story become just another unsolved file. But her voice trembled when she talked about her son. No verdict, no sentence will ever bring Marcus back, she said. For 34 years I've lived in a kind of limbo, unable to mourn, unable to move on, because there was always that small, cruel chance that he might still be alive. Now I know. And the knowing, it's heavier than the waiting ever was. Her face became stern. I forgive nobody, she replied. Not Brian. Not the ones who kept quiet. Not the ones who let this case go cold. Forgiveness is for those in need of peace. I don't need peace. I want my son back. And since that is not possible, I want the world to remember what was lost from him. Angela's voice was calm, level, and clear when she spoke. Marcus wasn't a name on a case file, she explained. He was my brother. He taught me how to ride a bike. He sat up with me when I was afraid of thunderstorms. He believed in me. For most of my life, I tried to forget this city and what went on here. But now I can stand still. Because at last we know the truth. Her own words continued to echo long after the cameras cut off, a final testament that justice, even decades too late, still has a cost.